All right, let's talk about nudge theory. It's this hugely influential idea, but it is definitely not without its critics. Today, we're going to dig into something really fascinating from the book Nudge itself, the chapter where the authors turn the spotlight around and tackle the biggest objections to their own work head on.
You see, this whole idea of gently guiding people, well, it's been picked up everywhere, right? By governments, by companies, but it's also kicked up a ton of debate. And really, it all boils down to one big question. Are these nudges a good thing, a helpful guide, or are we sliding down a path towards some kind of manipulation?
So, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to walk through the major arguments, just like the authors lay them out. We'll look at the slippery slope idea, the problem of who's doing the nudging, how it clashes with personal freedom, and even the flip side of the coin. Why not just force people to do the right thing?
Okay, let's get into it. The whole debate really orbits around this concept the authors call libertarian paternalism. To really get a handle on the objections, we first have to understand what the critics are actually pushing back against. So, the first big fear people bring up is that classic slippery slope. The worry is, if we accept a small, harmless-sounding nudge today, what's stopping a much more intrusive government from forcing our hand tomorrow? The question they keep asking is, where does it all stop?
And critics have a go-to example for this: smoking regulations. Think about it. It started out pretty small, right? Just some modest warning labels on cigarette packs. Then it became aggressive anti-smoking campaigns. Then came the super high taxes, and finally, outright bans on smoking in public places. For the critics, this is Exhibit A of the slippery slope in action, a clear line from a gentle suggestion to straight-up coercion.
So what's the comeback from the nudge authors? Well, their first point is that this whole slippery slope argument kind of sidesteps the real question. Is this specific nudge a good idea, right here, right now? They argue, look, we should judge every policy on its own merits, not shoot it down because of some vague fear about what might happen way down the line.
Their second point goes right back to the name of their idea: libertarian paternalism. They stress that for a nudge to be a true nudge, it has to include an easy, low-cost way for you to opt out. And if you can always just say, no thanks, well, they argue that slope gets a whole lot less slippery, doesn't it?
And their third point is probably the most powerful. They argue that some kind of nudge is basically inevitable. Choice architecture is literally everywhere. How is the food laid out in a cafeteria? That's a nudge. How is a voting ballot designed? That's a nudge. A default option has to be chosen one way or another. So the real question isn't if we should nudge, but how we should design them to actually help people.
Okay, so that leads us right into the next major worry. Even if we accept that nudges are unavoidable, what about the people designing them? Can we really trust these so-called choice architects to have our best interests at heart?
And this is where it gets tricky, because you have choice architects in the public sector, government folks, and in the private sector, think corporate execs. And let's be honest, both can have their own agendas. So, who should we be more worried about?
Now, when you actually compare the risks, you see a really key difference. Public architects, at least in theory, have to answer to voters, but they can also get captured by special interests or just be chasing political points. Private architects, their mission is crystal clear: maximize profits. And if consumers are confused about something, well, exploiting that confusion can be very, very profitable.
So what's the defense against all this? How do we protect ourselves? The authors point to this fantastic quote from Justice Louis Brandeis: "Sunlight is the best of disinfectants." And that's the key right there: transparency. If the nudge and the reasons behind it are out in the open for everyone to see, it's a lot harder for anyone to abuse the system.
This focus on keeping choice front and center leads us to a more philosophical problem. Shouldn't people just be free to make their own choices, even if that means they make mistakes? Isn't that how we learn?
The heart of this argument is that in a free society, you have the right to be wrong. And you know what? The authors completely agree with that. That is exactly why they're so insistent that you have to be able to opt out easily. You can always choose your own path, even if it's the wrong one.
But then they hit back with a pretty stark reality check. How much should a lesson cost? Should a tourist in London have to learn to look right by getting hit by a bus? Or is a simple nudge, just some words painted on the pavement, a much better and frankly more humane way to teach that lesson than a trip to the hospital?
This whole discussion really forces an important ethical question to the surface. If we're going to use nudging as a tool, we absolutely have to draw a clear line in the sand. We need rules of engagement that separate a helpful hint from, straight-up manipulation. And here's where you can really see that line. An acceptable nudge is out in the open. It's transparent. Think of a giant sign at a hot music festival yelling, "Drink more water." You see it, you know what it's telling you to do. Unacceptable manipulation, on the other hand, is sneaky. It's covert, invisible, like those old stories about subliminal ads trying to mess with your subconscious without you even knowing it.
So we need a simple test, right? A clear ethical principle that anyone can use, a citizen, a reporter, a politician, to figure out if a nudge is on the level or if it's crossing a line.
And for this, the authors borrow an idea from the philosopher John Rawls. It's called the publicity principle. And the test is actually really simple. Any policy, any nudge, should be something its architect is willing and able to defend publicly to its own citizens. Basically, if you aren't proud enough to tell people what you're doing and why, you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, so finally, let's look at the argument from the complete other direction. We've heard all the worries about too much government meddling, but what about not enough? If we know people make flawed decisions, and we know what the better choice is, why are we just gently nudging? Why not just mandate it?
This brings us to a concept called asymmetric paternalism. It sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty straightforward. You design policies that give huge benefits to the people who are most likely to mess up, while imposing the smallest possible costs on the people who already know what they're doing. A nudge is one way to do this, but this idea can also justify much stronger rules.
And the thing is, our society is already filled with these stronger interventions. We have mandatory cooling off periods for when you buy something from a pushy salesperson. We have waiting periods for marriage or divorce. We have workplace safety laws, Social Security. The list goes on and on. We already accept a lot of things that go way beyond a simple nudge.
So when you look at all these objections and all these counter-arguments, it all comes back to one single powerful conclusion from the authors. We simply cannot escape being influenced by the design of our world. Choice architecture is inevitable. It's not a question of if we should have it. The real question, the one we all have to grapple with, is this: who gets to be the designer, and how do we make sure they're doing it thoughtfully, ethically, and out in the open for all of us to see?